Good morning and welcome to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. My name is Jacob Kurtzer. I'm very grateful and pleased to see so many friendly and new faces here today. For those watching online, welcome to CSIS Online. For those in person, you'll know that, at least for the humanitarian agenda, we're a safety-first oriented program. So the first thing I'm going to do is point out our emergency exit signs back here and the way you came in. In case of any emergency, I would ask that you follow my instructions or the instructions of my colleague, Jude Larnard, for evacuation of the building. This morning's session is the opening of a two-day conference CSIS, the Humanitarian Agenda, is co-hosting in partnership with the Norwegian Refugee Council and supported generously by the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance at USAID. Humanitarian access remains the predominant challenge for the humanitarian community and the various different challenges that organizations and individuals affected by armed conflict face to receive the basic needs that they need to sustain themselves. 4 years ago, CSIS, again with the support of then OFDA, launched a task force on humanitarian access to look at the challenges in the contemporary humanitarian universe. We published a report, held a lot of consultations, and access and trying to overcome the access challenges, be they logistical, be they security, be they assertive states, or be they from the policies and regulations imposed by donors, remains a central theme for the humanitarian agenda to this day. And yet any casual observer of the humanitarian spectrum would understand that in many ways the access environment has gotten worse, not better. And even the news of the recent days suggests that it's going to get worse further with onset of fighting in Sudan and other challenges. So to kick us off today, we're extremely grateful to have a really meaningful and high-level panel. I'll spare introducing our speakers, but I'd like to just introduce our moderator, Rodi Margeson. As long as I've worked in the humanitarian sector in Washington, Rodi has been a source of great knowledge for me and for the humanitarian advocacy and policy community. Rodi teaches in the Global Fellows Program at the University of Maryland, and in her day job is a specialist in humanitarian policy for the Congressional Research Service. So, Rodi, if I can invite you up to share some remarks and lead our conversation.
Jake, thank you for that kind introduction. Good morning, everyone. I want to express a warm welcome to our keynote speakers, Sarah Charles and Jan Egeland, and to all of you participating in person and online. This conference on sustaining access, humanitarian principles, practice, and policy for today's challenges provides an important opportunity to discuss humanitarian access amid unprecedented global humanitarian challenges. In a moment, I will introduce our speakers. First, though, I would like to set the stage with a few words about the scope of today's global humanitarian landscape. The views expressed here are mine and do not represent those of the Congressional Research Service or the Library of Congress. In 2003, the United Nations estimates that globally, nearly 340 million people, which includes over 103 million who are displaced, require urgent humanitarian and protection assistance. This is the highest on record, and experts say the numbers are likely to increase, with demand continuing to outpace funding, the distribution of which is often uneven across crises. A combination of new and protracted conflicts, persistent violence, climate-induced and other natural disasters, ongoing secondary impacts of COVID-19, economic shocks, and increasing malnutrition and food insecurity worldwide are primary drivers of this unprecedented level of humanitarian need. 4 years ago, when CSIS first published its Humanitarian Access Report, the UN 2019 Global Humanitarian Appeal sought $21.9 billion. The UN 2023 Global Humanitarian Appeal is for $51.5 billion. This is $30 billion higher and 2.5 times greater than in 2019. During this time, the number of people in need has also nearly tripled. The 2023 appeal reaches another new record amount for humanitarian funding appeals. Amid increasing global needs, humanitarian access remains a critical issue. It is considered a key to humanitarian action and the provision of life-saving assistance to vulnerable communities. Access restrictions such as conflict and insecurity, bureaucratic impediments, and physical constraints often hinder the work of relief agencies and their ability to respond to humanitarian and recovery needs, which some also assert make the humanitarian situation not only worse, but more costly. Events in Sudan over the last week and a half provide a glaring example. During this conference, we will have the opportunity to discuss current challenges affecting the ability of aid providers to operate in constrained environments and explore ways to refine humanitarian practice and policy to enable effective and principled response in hard-to-reach communities. The full program will explore the evolving access landscape in complex humanitarian responses. The breakout sessions will identify emerging trends in humanitarian access, including the impact of counterterrorism activities on principled humanitarian action, negotiating with non-traditional authorities, and working with local actors on the front lines. The theme of this morning's opening session is preserving and protecting principled humanitarian access. Sarah Charles will speak on efforts the US Agency for International Development is taking to ensure principled humanitarian access around the world. Jan Egeland will offer remarks on the Norwegian Refugee Council's efforts to achieve critical access across their operations. Following their remarks, we will have a conversation. It is now my honor to introduce our speakers. Sarah Charles is the assistant to the administrator of USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, or BHA, the US government lead for international disaster response. With a mandate to save lives, alleviate human suffering, and reduce the impact of disasters, BHA monitors, mitigates, and responds to global hazards and humanitarian needs. The Bureau also promotes resilience by preparing communities for disasters before they strike and by helping people recover and move beyond crises. Prior to her role at BHA, Sarah was the Senior Director for Policy and Advocacy for the International Rescue Committee. And before that, she staffed the National Security Council at the White House, first as the Director for Humanitarian Affairs, and then as the Director and Acting Senior Director for Strategic Planning. In these roles, Sarah played a central role in coordinating the international Ebola response and later coordinated the White House response to the global refugee and migration crisis, including the 2016 Leaders' Summit on Refugees. Jan Egeland has been the Secretary General of NRC since August 2013, a role that oversees the work of the humanitarian organization in over 30 countries affected by conflict and disaster. In June 2021, he was appointed to promote and advocate for the advancement of commitments known as the Grand Bargain, an agreement between donors and humanitarian organizations to improve humanitarian action and better serve people in need. In 2021, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres appointed Jan as chair of the Independent Senior Advisory Panel on Humanitarian Deconfliction in Syria. In 2015, former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon appointed Jan as special advisor to the UN Special Envoy for Syria, where he chaired the humanitarian task force responsible for the safety and protection of Syrian civilians, a role he stepped down from in 2018. From 2011 to 2013, Jan served as the European Director of Human Rights Watch. And prior to that, he was appointed Special Advisor to the UN Secretary General for Conflict Prevention and Resolution. Jan was the UN Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator from 2003 to 2006. In that role, he helped reform the global humanitarian response system and organize the international response to many humanitarian crises. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to our speakers. And with that, I will now turn things over to Sarah Charles. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Jake, and thank you, Jake. And thank you, Rhodey, for that warm introduction. And in particular, thank you, CSIS and NRC, for the invitation to speak today. We're incredibly proud of the work that our partners, that many of those on your team do in the face of incredible obstacles every day. Standing here right now, it's impossible not to have front of mind our many Sudanese colleagues that are in Sudan as we speak, who have sustained repeated attacks as Sudan descends into almost unthinkable violence. We are committed to delivering principled, need-based humanitarian assistance in the face of skyrocketing needs. However, as many in this room know well, humanitarian access constraints remain one of the largest hurdles to delivering this support to those most in need. Every day, bureaucratic impediments, attacks on aid workers, outright blockades, and the politicization of humanitarian aid make it harder for responders to both identify and reach people in need of life-saving assistance. There is almost always a direct correlation between access and need. Nowhere is this more evident than in Burkina Faso. For more than a year, non-state groups have imposed a full blockade on Djibo in Sayoum province, home to more than 360 people. Our famine early warning system, or FuseNet, now projects a credible risk of famine in Djibo, a threat that did not exist before the blockade started. There are also widespread reports of severe wasting in children, as well as adults already dying of hunger. This tragedy, far off the front page, was and is preventable. At AID, we are committed to helping our partners navigate these increasingly complex and dangerous environments and supporting aid workers around the world who face incredible risk in preserving life and human dignity. We are constantly asking ourselves at every level, how can we do more to support our partners? What can we do to lead and influence policies and actions that will facilitate greater access? Last month, Administrator Power released USAID's new policy framework, Driving Progress Beyond Programs. In it, USAID formally articulates our goals to confront the greatest challenges of our times, embrace new partnerships, and invest in enduring effectiveness. It serves as a frame for all of our efforts. We're proud of the achievements of the programs we fund around the world, not least of which the very important work we're supporting NRC to develop and strengthen the negotiating skills of humanitarian professionals, including through this conference today. But we also recognize to ensure USAID-funded programs have the greatest impact and ultimately create real change in the lives of many millions of people living in vulnerable situations, we need to leverage our voice as the US government. We are all keenly aware that humanitarian space is shrinking. This group knows all too well physical and institutional threats to aid work and aid workers. Every year, attacks on our colleagues, particularly our local staff, grow. Even as we meet today, we see this tragically playing out in Sudan with the escalation of fighting between the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudanese Armed Forces. The fighting has forced many humanitarian agencies to make the difficult decision to temporarily halt life-saving operations and evacuate staff from Sudan. Armed actors are targeting humanitarian assets and facilities, looting field vehicles, and damaging aircraft used to transport aid workers and assistance where they're needed most. At least 5 humanitarian personnel have already been killed in this conflict. Hundreds of humanitarian programs have been temporarily paused as a result of partners' inability to safely operate, impacting millions of vulnerable people in Sudan, including those recently displaced by this fighting. Today, local and national staff, often responding in their own communities, account for nearly all deaths, injuries, and kidnappings of humanitarian aid workers. We need real, tangible, and urgent solutions to protect them. Through our multi-year access project with NRC, we're building the capacity of the humanitarian community, from frontline workers to senior officials, to enable humanitarian access and programming in hard-to-reach areas. This work builds upon millions of dollars spanning more than a decade into humanitarian safety and security research and coordination, and the OCHA-funded To Stay and Deliver study, which prompted a seismic paradigm shift in humanitarian aid work more than a decade ago. Rather than determining the triggers that would lead an organization to leave an area due to conflict and insecurity, the goal for the last decade has been to prioritize efforts that enable organizations to stay on the ground and facilitate access to those in need. Unfortunately, much of the Stay and Deliver framework has resulted in the unintended consequence of transferring risk to local implementing partners and local aid workers. Now more than ever, we must double down on efforts to protect these local partners and local staff and reverse this trend. While research and training play an important role in improving access to populations in need and mitigating risks, we know that the rate of violence against aid workers largely relates to proximity to conflict, shrinking humanitarian space, and the politicization, if not weaponization, of humanitarian assistance. Diplomacy, advocacy, and new ways of working must go hand in hand with capacity building to protect aid workers and safeguard humanitarian operational independence and impartiality. Even when organizations are able to stay and deliver, physical barriers are cutting off access to millions of people in need. We saw this acutely in Ethiopia, where access to Tigray was restricted for nearly 2 years. Restrictions on physical access were compounded by blackouts on the internet, telecommunications, and banking services. Before the signing of the cessation of hostilities agreement in November, USAID largely measured access by the trickling of trucks that entered the region and metric tons of assistance carried by those trucks. But trucks are not access, and food, while important, is not sufficient for human well-being. In systematically blocking access, even when they allowed limited trucks in, the government of Ethiopia hamstrung the humanitarian response. As a community, we were denied the kind of sustained presence that would enable deep engagement of affected communities and the delivery of services, particularly for protection services, services for survivors of sexual violence, that we know should be part of every humanitarian response. In the less often talked about protection crisis in the Central Sahel, civilians continue to be targets of violence, face increasing displacement, and are deprived of basic services and livelihood opportunities needed to access food. In addition, women and girls face high risks of gender-based violence, including sexual exploitation and abuse. As armed groups continue to expand their area of influence, access constraints become even higher. Reaching back to the example of Burkina Faso, where armed groups have blockaded several cities, the World Food Programme estimates that 850,000 people, about 1/3 of the population in need, are residing in blockaded or hard-to-reach areas that lack basic services. We currently support WFP to use helicopters to airlift assistance to blockaded areas, which is expensive, unsustainable, and lacks the protection-focused interventions that we know are needed in periods of acute conflict. As you all well know, our jobs are even harder when humanitarian access is politicized. In Syria, we've provided assistance to more than 4 million people in the Northwest, including through the cross-border operation for over a decade. At the time of the February 6 earthquake, however, UN cross-border access was limited to only a single crossing, Baba al-Hawa. While the UN was able to negotiate the opening of 2 additional crossings in the weeks following the earthquake for a period of 3 months, it's unclear if they will remain open. The US government has long supported our NGO partners to use all available crossings into Syria. It's gutting that the Syrian regime and the Russian Federation see life-saving assistance as a bargaining chip every year, every 6 months, and now every 3 months. We will, of course, continue to advocate for the use of all 3 border crossings, as the continuation of cross-border assistance is critical to meet the acute needs of Syrians wherever they're in need. In Afghanistan, the Taliban's multiple edicts barring women from working for NGOs, and now the UN, are of course gross human rights violations, part of a systematic effort to restrict women's participation in public life. But they're also deeply obstructive. While we appreciate that partners have been able to negotiate carve-outs, these efforts by the Taliban prevent humanitarian assistance from reaching female beneficiaries at scale and expose them to further life-saving risks. We are determined to prevent the normalization of this obstruction. We recognize the increasingly difficult operating environment that the Taliban has created, which has already resulted in reduced operations for many of our partners. Engaging and supporting women is critical, and nothing less is acceptable. Women are a critical component of a society and cannot be erased by these edicts. In line with our commitment to progress beyond programs, we're funding urgently needed humanitarian assistance activities to those in greatest need, while also working to ensure that advocacy is at the heart of our action. This includes promoting the safety and security of aid workers, particularly in hard-to-reach or insecure environments. In Haiti, despite tremendous challenges, BHA partners and other humanitarian actors are proving every day, in this context that is often overlooked, that access is possible, even if variable and complicated. In Cité Soleil, for example, engagement by UN agencies with gangs last year enabled access to communities most severely affected by the crisis in Port-au-Prince. The latest food security analysis shows that the resulting increase in assistance was instrumental in preventing famine-like conditions. However, a recent surge in violence has again increased access challenges in Cité Soleil, underscoring just how precarious the situation is and how important sustained and elevated engagement is. We continue to urge partners to work collectively to reach those in need, including by engaging parties where necessary to gain access. Having a coordinated and principled approach to engagement, with gangs in particular, is crucial in this context, and we're committed to supporting our partners and platforms like the Access Working Group to ensure that aid safely reaches those most affected by the crisis. We also support organizations around the globe, such as Humanitarian Outcomes, Insecurity Insight, the Global Interagency Security Forum, and the International NGO Safety Organization, or INSO, which provides security coordination and analysis to help NGOs operate safely in complex environments like Haiti. The crisis in Afghanistan and many of the examples highlighted today also underscore the importance and relevance of some of our global programs, such as USAID and the State Department's joint Safe from the Start revision policy and program. Safe from the Start seeks to advance gender transformative approaches in humanitarian response and promotes women's leadership. In particular, prioritizing support and advocacy for gender-based violence prevention and shifts in funding, influence, and decision-making power to women and girls in all their diversity within humanitarian response systems. Safe from the Start revision calls on the humanitarian community and supports the humanitarian community to not only add to, but change conventional humanitarian response by, among other things, shifting power to crisis-affected women and girls and recognizing them as experts, providers, and leaders, which can only serve to strengthen responses such as the one in Afghanistan. Alongside our programs, we're engaged in the day-in, day-out diplomacy that's needed to secure humanitarian access and resolution of conflict. There are few donors that are as present in as many places as we are. Part of that presence is working with partners, but also our embassies and other parts of the U.S. government on efforts to deter violations of international humanitarian law and secure unconditional humanitarian access and operational independence for humanitarian organizations and their personnel, especially among non-state armed groups. In Ethiopia, for example, U.S. diplomats, including our USAID DART, or Disaster Assistance Response Team, worked tirelessly to support the November 2022 signing of the Cessation of Hostilities Agreement. Since the agreement was finalized, humanitarian access, and as a result, humanitarian conditions into northern Ethiopia's Afar, Amhara, and particularly Tigray regions has continued to improve. Furthermore, building on the many years of advocacy from many of those in the room, I see Joel Charney standing here, as well as the convening efforts of CSIS, the U.S., along with our co-drafter, Ireland, led efforts to secure the passage of the UN Security Council Resolution 2664 in December, which created a carve-out from the asset freeze provisions of UN sanctions programs. The resolution ensures that humanitarian assistance can still flow in contexts where UN sanctions target malicious actors, while maintaining critical provisions that prevent aid from being diverted by the very regimes and actors that are inflicting harm on their people. The resolution further makes clear that the UN's critical sanctions tool should not inadvertently tie the hands of humanitarian actors trying to reach the victims of repressive and brutal regimes. The U.S. was the first country in the world to implement the new Security Council resolution with the issuance of general licenses by the Department of Treasury's Office of Foreign Asset Control, or OFAC. These general licenses ease the delivery of much-needed humanitarian aid and other priority programs. Now we need other major donors, particularly in the European Union and its member states, to do their part in also providing these humanitarian exemptions. In closing, we don't see ourselves as merely donors, but as partners, problem solvers, and advocates. I join with you today in a spirit of partnership to work through our greatest challenges as a community whose members each bring unique insight and unique value. My sincere hope is that all of you take away from this conference new knowledge and skills to share and integrate into your everyday work. We also want to learn from you about how we can better support your life-saving mission. We continue to invite fellow humanitarian donors to join us in funding humanitarian research and access initiatives, including the training of frontline negotiations, pre-implementation, management, and maintenance. We further encourage dedicated funds for locally employed personnel safety and security measures, including training, communication equipment, and comprehensive duty of care support. For our part, we will continue to strongly oppose efforts to politicize humanitarian assistance and actions that undermine the impartiality and neutrality of humanitarian organizations. And along with our State Department colleagues, we will continue to engage in humanitarian diplomacy efforts across the world to ensure that the operating space for humanitarian workers and aid remains as open as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for a wonderful opening speech, for a very important discussion, a very important conference. And I would like to congratulate partners here in Washington, D.C. for putting access on the agenda. It's too often not discussed globally, regionally, nationally, because I think we all agree here today that too many people suffer completely alone in their hour of greatest need. We're not there when they need us. And we're not there for two reasons. Number one, as was said by Rodi in the beginning, the number of people in need has exploded. I'm an old man, and I've been in humanitarian work since the 1970s. The numbers have really historically exploded in a way that we never thought would be possible in a growing world economy. The 340 million in need this year, and it's 60 million higher than the year before. So, the main reason that people suffer alone is that the resource gap is widening. We have less funding per person in need, per person that's fleeing their homes, more than well over 100 million compared to 40 million in the terrible 1990s. And many more hungry, and many more suffering both conflict and climate change. So again, more people are more exposed to more conflict and to climate change than ever before. But then there is the other reason. We are held back, we're blocked, we're not able to go to the families, to the children, women, men who need us. And that's what we're discussing today. There is not access. They have a right to receive our assistance. We have an obligation to provide assistance, and we're held back. In many circumstances, we can do something about that. We could become much better in securing access, principled access, learning from our mistakes, learning from all of the less hard-won lessons of humanitarian work since Henri Dunant at the Battle of Solferino in 1859. So, NRC has been working systematically now for 10 years in reaching the so-called hard-to-reach areas. We identified 10 years back, this would be our contribution. We're an organization with some experience. We were founded in 1946. We have some resources. We have a culture of living by the principles, teaching the principles, learning from our mistakes. So systematically, we invested in this. And I would say the number one partner the last few years has been USAID and the Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance. And what we have been able to do with that partnership is also build partnerships like never before on humanitarian negotiations. Last year, 2022, 1,000 people, toolbox, the international toolbox and the local toolbox in reaching people before it is too late. We chair, because of our partnerships, we chair a lot of humanitarian access groups, often with OCHA on the national level. When there are humanitarian access groups, access improves. There's no doubt about it. And all in the humanitarian country team get better in reaching the places where we are not. In working with local organizations, local actors, local authorities, local parties to conflicts to reach these places. And we are doing now humanitarian hard-to-reach assessments, access assessments. And what's coming out is that there are three obstacles, really, three categories of obstacles: logistics, insecurity and conflict, bureaucratic obstacles, restrictive governments, restrictive parties. Logistics is probably actually the least now in this time and age of our problems. It's often related to resources. You cannot anymore fly to the place. You cannot reach it. There is a natural disaster. There is no physical access. We have too little resources logistically to reach places. We can overcome that. We need more resources. The second one is more difficult. It's the insecurity. It's the conflict. And Sarah mentioned Sudan, where the craziness of two generals has led a whole country bleeding and has paralyzed all humanitarian work. So at the moment, there is really no access. I mean, of course, we're working in several regions still, but the majority of the millions in need, internally displaced refugees and others, are not reached because of the internal armed conflict, intra-military conflict. Again, this will be overcome. Hopefully not all internationals will leave. There will be leadership also left in the countries for the larger organizations so that we can resume work as soon as possible. The optics are not good that the internationals are leaving and women and children are behind to fend for themselves. The insecurity is, of course, most difficult when we are targeted. And the places where we're targeted by organizations who have declared us as part of the enemy, those are the most difficult places. So, in a way, it's More challenging, in my view, places in the Sahel where armed groups have declared us as their enemy than conventional warfare, where we have methods to do risk management. But then comes the third obstacle, and that's the worst. It's the worst. And so the restrictive government, restrictive bureaucracies, assertive governments, assertive parties who don't want internationals there. They don't want humanitarians there. They don't want witnesses. They don't want independent humanitarian action. They don't want impartial humanitarian action. And one country after the other, it's become more difficult to stay and deliver, difficult to get in expertise, leadership, very difficult for local partners and organizations to move around, to work according to the humanitarian principles. And this one we have to fight, really. Are we letting the assertive authoritarian regimes win by keeping us out? Keeping witnesses out, keeping impartial operations that are there to go after needs and not after whom the regime or the parties want us to help. I think this is going to be our greatest challenge in the time to come, because it is even more difficult to mitigate than the insecurity and the logistics in most places. So, what do we do? What do we do? Number one, I think we need to agree that it is unacceptable that tens of millions of people suffer alone. We're not there. We need more resources, and we need it for the neglected and forgotten emergencies. I just come from Central America. Very strong impressions here of these families and these migrants who are in a horrendous situation. And the humanitarian response plans are a quarter funded. And the migrants are going on flip-flops through the Darien Gap. There's no one there for them. It's unacceptable, and it's really unacceptable that regimes let parts of the population that they are responsible for suffer rather than have independent, impartial humanitarian action, local, national, international, reach them. Second, we need to increase capacity for access negotiations, access acceptance, access, the whole toolbox of humanitarian actions work. I think it's important to remember that we've learned something over the last 150 years, really. It is possible to build acceptance. It is possible to get even armed actors to wars to understand that it is in their interest that there is no epidemic disease. There is that you let the civilian population on the other side get food, then it's also possible to get your own civilian population to get food. The reciprocity, there is a lot of rules and regulations in humanitarian law that helps access, but that's not necessarily intuitive. So the training sponsored by USAID, for example, is very important. The local knowledge also has to be brought to us. We come from outside. Yes, we know of humanitarian law, humanitarian principles, international rules and regulations. We have experience from many difficult situations. But they know of their local customs, they know of their local languages, they know of their local traditions, really. They can help. So it's also listen and learn in a dialogue if you want to have access. Thirdly, there needs to be advocacy. There needs to be private advocacy. There needs to be public advocacy. I think it's important that we do not accept that there are now an increasing number of places where the military rulers and the dictators and the authoritarian regimes and the parties to conflict are getting away with murder, really, because we're not there. And we're afraid for the little access we have, and therefore we don't tell about the access we lack. Fourth, humanitarian diplomacy is important. We need to have principled, systematic outreach to all who can influence the situation. Often our close partners, the donor countries, have influence. Many places they don't. Sarah mentioned, the outrageous banning of female colleagues in Afghanistan. I mean, the emir in Kandahar is not really listening to the NATO countries that were beaten in battle. If they listen to anyone, it would be other Islamic countries, the neighbors, those who are there, those who did not leave, etc. We need to work with them. We need to work with the Russians, because we don't have access to the Russian-occupied areas of Ukraine. And the situation is worse on average in those areas than in those controlled by the government of Ukraine. And we have to do that even though our donors are on one side of this conflict. We're neutral. We will remain also neutral in Ukraine, and we need to accept that many of our local partners do not see themselves as neutral. We need to live by the principles because we should be on all sides of the conflict. And finally, I think localization, that we're discussing a lot, and communication with affected communities will also help us with access. We need to listen to those who are there, get them to advise on what's possible, what they want, etc., and marry that with the international humanitarian principles. Only then can we reach the millions we are now not reaching because access is denied. Thank you.
While we get the mic situation sorted.
Sarah, you can tell I'm not never start to work in television, ever. Stay in.
Great. Well, thank you both for your insightful remarks. Before we turn to some other questions, I actually wanted to see if we could talk about this question that Sarah raised about leveraging, in this case, the US government, USAID voice. But Jan also spoke very eloquently about the different points that he was making on things that we could do. Where do we go from here? And I'm wondering if we could look at that a little bit more closely, what this leverage, how we leverage, when we leverage, who should be leveraging. And if, Sarah, you could speak to the US government and partners, and perhaps, Jan, you could talk to the NRC, but also the broader humanitarian UN, specifically, community. because it seems to me that there has been a lot of work done on humanitarian access and thinking about it, but how do we actually apply this? One size does not fit all. There are different situations across the globe, as you both have drawn out certain examples, but I'm hearing also that we need a bit of a sea change in how we leverage our voices and make this known. So I'm going to turn to Sarah first, and then to Jan. Thank you.
So Jan spoke eloquently about the importance and the centrality of humanitarian principles and neutrality in particular for our humanitarian partners. I think on the BHA side, on the USAID side, we fully recognize that one piece of our role is protecting the space for our partners to act in an impartial, in a neutral way, that our support is given impartially. But the US government itself is not a neutral actor, and we have certainly diplomatic tools, leverage at our disposal. And one of the pieces of what Administrator Power talks about in terms of progress beyond programs, and also the value of having a seat for USAID at the National Security Council table, which has not always been the case, is there are forums both at a local level between our humanitarian staff on the ground and our embassies, but also back here in Washington, for us to elevate these issues of humanitarian diplomacy, of actions that can and should be taken in order to create the enabling environment that allows our partners to act in an impartial and neutral way in the delivery of assistance. And we take that responsibility incredibly seriously at BHA. I think for some staff, it's a new skill set. It's very different than kind of being technical advisors on humanitarian programs, but starting to use our voice and increasingly to use our voice again in advocating for what we think will improve conditions on the ground for the people that we're collectively concerned about. That requires very close contact, deep discussions with our NGO partners, with our UN interlocutors. There is often a bit of a division of labor between things we can say out loud that other actors can't, or things we can raise in private diplomacy, put on the table, have access to actors that maybe your teams don't have, and again, getting us all a little bit more comfortable with that dialogue is part of what we're doing in BHA.
I think I agree with all of that, Sarah. In the humanitarian world, I often find analysis pretty weak of who's really in charge here, who can unlock this, who's behind the evil, how can we reach those who can influence those who are there. And of course, it is a problem that we are totally unevenly funded. It's a Western thing to fund humanitarian aid. I mean, we have Japan, which is also part politically of the Western project in many ways. It will be a big effort for all of us to try to get Iran and Russia and China and so on to try to influence. Myanmar is not influenced by the West. The Taliban is not influenced by the West. Mali is not influenced by the West anymore. The French are out. Colonial powers are out. And it's not easy for us to get Moscow now to listen to us. We did in NRC a lot of work, went to Moscow. I always met with the US, the Russian missions. They helped us in Venezuela. They helped us in many places. With the Ukraine war, it has become much more difficult. What I hope is, of course, that the West, like the US, can help us where they can help us, like Israel, which is, of course, not so a comfortable thing necessarily. But I use this opportunity to say it's outrageous what the new Israeli government is doing in terms of access and opportunities to help Palestinian children in the West Bank and Gaza. And that's an area where we hope the US can help us. And then we have to approach the others on say, the Taliban in Afghanistan.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to draw out a piece of this which relates to something that both of you raised on localization. And so, Sarah, if I may, I'll turn to you first. USAID and BHA specifically have made a big push to include local partners in humanitarian responses worldwide. Do you see more localized responses as helping overcome challenges to humanitarian access, and if so, how? And the reason I'm partly asking this is USAID has made this big push, and yet a very low percentage really across the board has been actually given to and worked through local partners. So it's a conundrum. And it's a safety and security question, it's lots of things, but if you could unpack that for us for a little bit, that would be great.
I think there's no question that the reality is that in many contexts, local partners have access that international organizations do not. And so even when you start to kind of dig into the money flows, at the end of the day, it is often local NGOs that are doing the delivery of assistance in the hardest to reach places. That was no doubt the case in Northwest Syria, and one of the big tenets of our earthquake response was trying to channel as many resources as possible directly or as close to directly to Syrian organizations that were operational on the ground, particularly in Northwest Syria. We did this through a couple of different channels, both direct awards to a select number of local partners, but also putting a significant amount, close to $60 million behind 2 cross-border pooled funds that the majority of that funding flowed to local Syrian organizations. So it is definitely part of our approach to support local organizations more directly, particularly in these contexts where they have access. I think it is not the solution to access, as Jan mentioned in his remarks. There are places and spaces where international presence has a protective effect. And we still very much want to advocate, including in Northwest Syria. And one of the very small bright lights we've seen in the post-earthquake period in Northwest Syria is the resumption of kind of UN presence in a limited way after years of them not being present in Northwest Syria. And again, there is a protective element to that kind of international presence in these types of contexts, and I think we certainly don't want to see a scenario where we're again just shifting risk, even if it's with additional resources, shifting risk to local partners in these contexts where that kind of full ecosystem of local partners working in real partnership and concert with international actors is needed to make real progress on these access issues.
Yeah. May I use the opportunity to actually congratulate USAID by making a big push on localization and being now, US going from having little attention to this to have a lot of attention to this. And then I have my hat on as the eminent person of the grand bargain here also, where the goal is 25%, as you say. Globally, it could be 2, 3, or 4%, depending on how you count money going through. It could be more if you count all money going through the UN to the local group. Way behind. USAID is making a big leap. I think we will see change. The other one to congratulate the US on is should have done that. The sanctions carve out for humanitarian work under sanctions regime and counterterrorism legislation is admirable. The US has gone from being the worst during the previous administration to become the best of the Western powers of this, actually. I mean, the French are now behind on this. It shows that things can change and access can improve also by policy decisions. In wartime, the best blend is local groups with international groups. There's no doubt about it. We have a conscious decision. We're not going to chase natural disasters in any places without a conflict. The local groups are more expensive than us. They're on the ground. They will be able to respond immediately. Why should we come from Norway to the Philippines when there is a Filipino Red Cross? Much better. However, there is no doubt that in many of these conflict situations, the local groups are very vulnerable. They are often partisan. I would be if there was a war in my country, actually. And the blend of internationals and locals is the best to reach people on all sides of the conflicts. Like in Syria, where we're in the northwest, east, northeast, and in the government-controlled areas as NRC, don't publish it too much. And we're working with local groups in all of these three areas, and they are poles apart as local groups.
Yes, thank you. Jan, you mentioned how much we have learned also over past decades in our response, and particularly with humanitarian access. And I'm curious about your response to this, and Sarah, you as well. Many observers do not speak as much now about COVID-19 and the humanitarian sector, but for a period of time, there was talk of how it could transform humanitarian response, including with respect to access, as international NGOs evacuated international staff and leaned more heavily on remote management and local actors. What, if any, lessons have been learned from humanitarian responses taking place during the pandemic that, if applied, might help relieve some of the barriers to this international access question?
I mean, two things. The first and biggest is the good thing that we really realize that we swim or we sink with our national staff, really. National staff courageously went into the camps just before the lockdown in many places and stayed in the camps, many places, Uganda, Jordan and so on, for weeks and months, basically, serving the refugees when we knew the camps would be closed, for example, for refugee camps. And it just showed that we can nationalize much more than we thought when that kind of a process. The ratio would often be 1,000 local national staff, 5 internationals. Would we need international? I think it's not a bad thing with international for transfer of knowledge, etc., and also for reporting, etc. What's possibly bad is that we think that more can be done remotely than should be done remotely, and here comes in protection. You know, cash is the best way of giving support, but if the cash is by the ether into a phone or a card, and the bad guys comes next day and take everything, or tell us what's happening. Tell us, has there been sexual and gender-based violence? Yes, well, a lot of it. Was it you who told that we are criminals and we're not there in proximity? It's not good. So actually, the remoteness of operations has clear problems, and it's part of the access. access is challenge, we need to be there. We need to have proximity to the people in need.
Sarah, do you have anything you want to add?
Maybe just to add, and kind of in violent agreement with Jan, I think no doubt COVID highlighted the critical nature again of kind of those localized responses, whether it be local staff of international organizations or local organizations themselves, but also the limitations of that remote management. And when we saw the edicts come down in Afghanistan first in December and now more recently extending the ban on female aid workers to the UN as well, I think many of our partners have at various points looked to some of those coping strategies from that COVID period to look at, are there ways to support female staff to, do man hotlines or do the kind of remote management approaches that were adopted during the most acute phases of the COVID response. And while there's some potential there, I think there's also real limitations. And I think we do, as Jan said, we see this most acutely in the kind of protection work that we know is so critical in all humanitarian responses, but particularly when we have these significant access challenges. And that can't be replaced by kind of cash transfers on mobile phones or airdrops or episodic kind of delivery opportunities of food. It really requires sustained engagement, individual case management, safe spaces for women and children and other victims of abuse or other vulnerable individuals. So I think we have to be careful not to overstate the potential of some of these approaches.
Yes, thanks. All right, so Sarah, conflict remains a major driver of humanitarian need and denied access. Yet the increase in the effects of climate change also portend a future where infrastructure weaknesses and limited disaster response present formidable hurdles. What are ways USAID and BHA can plan or is planning for those kinds of crises and ways to build greater access and resilience?
Well, Jan touched a bit on it when he said NRC has made a decision. We're not going to go into the Philippines after a Typhoon Rai or respond to natural disasters in that kind of jump in, jump out sort of way. I think we actually do have some good learning, some good experience, particularly in Asia and Latin America, in working over a very long period of time with very local organizations as well as authorities. This is where the kind of the neutrality and impartiality conversations sometimes get a little trickier as we start to talk about adaptation approaches, where we really have invested and are scaling up our investment in those very localized adaptation and preparedness approaches. I'll put a plug in for our Climate Smart Disaster Ready APS that has been out on the street, $200 million to support local approaches to adaptation and disaster risk reduction. Again, really seeing the future of a lot of our climate adaptation and risk reduction work with local actors, whether they be civil society organizations or local institutions, including local government and regional governments.
I agree.
Do you want to add anything on that?
It was well said by Sarah.
I agree. Mm-hmm. Okay, so Jan, you recently tweeted about branding and the way humanitarian organizations are compelled to label many of their contributions. To what extent do you think branding increases access challenges? Might a more subtle approach be valuable in contested environments, and what might this look like?
Yeah, no, it has gotten a lot of attention. The tweet on the branding, I said it's increasingly distasteful how we as international donors and international aid agencies have to advertise ourselves on school bags and on children, in the countries where we work. So it's more like let's lower a little bit our charity, and let's rather be a little bit more interested in the dignity of the people we serve. Branding is, of course, important also, but however, for access. The Red Cross emblem, reverse of the Swiss flag, was invented as a protective emblem. The blue flag of the UN is the protected emblem. Our orange is a protective emblem, and in many, many circumstances, it works. So, of course, we go into, as unarmed, into areas and and there should be a flag on our vehicles. And also, for honesty, we should tell who we are. I mean, we're running around as guests in these countries. They should know who we are. So we should be branded. The problem, again, is the moment we're targeted. In Sudan, I don't think we're targeted for being humanitarian. I think we're targeted because we have fuel and vehicles and things, and they have lost control over there is no unity of command. Typical situation. In Al-Qaeda, ISIS, they don't like us or anyone else. They like themselves, basically, and they come after us. And there it is a real decision. Do we go undercover, which is not good for humanitarians, but we do it for survival issues. In general, we should brand ourselves. We shouldn't brand the people we help. We don't need to tell them that it's Norwegian or US assistance that is really helping you, or that NRC is really giving this tent. It shouldn't be anything on. It should be theirs, not ours.
Yes, fair enough. Sarah, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'll just add, I think, this is one of those places where we really come to our partners in that spirit of partnership. And I think we have a pretty good track record of working with our partners for very context-specific approaches to branding, including, in many cases, waiving branding requirements if the security situation is such that would endanger the work. I will say, I have heard from my fellow donors increasing grumbling that there's very heavy branding of, some of our partners, and that they're hearing from their political masters. And I think it's worth remembering, as much as I'm here, quote, as the donor, the real donor is the U.S. public. Through their representatives in the U.S. Congress, and there is kind of the face and the story that we have with the people that we're working with, that we're supporting, the branding that makes sense in context, and then there's also, I think, work that, frankly, collectively we need to do to kind of, quote, give credit and tell the story of what kind of our respective populations have been able to support in terms of the power and the work overseas. And that balance is not easy, but I do worry sometimes when we look at branding in too narrow a way, there is a risk too of losing a little bit of that story with our public, frankly, that allows us to continue to support the important work.
I see that. I mean, and we need to be better to really explain to the general public that assistance works. We're saving lives. We're getting children into school. We're providing livelihoods. It's the only way. I mean, again, Central America. If there's no hope for the youth in Central America, they will all wander north, and there is possible to create both education, livelihoods, safety, security. We're doing that, and we need to get that story across. We need to be better in that. But I think the solution to this, donors coming and seeing that UN agencies have plastered their thing all over the place, and wasn't it us, the ECHO, European Union, who gave it? And so we need also to have it on. Take away both, logos. In my view, you don't have the UN agencies or NRC one, and you don't have to have the Norwegian government thing. They should be spared that one.
Yes, thank you. So I'd like to ask one more question before we wrap up this session, and I will ask for you to be mindful of time. I know it's a big question, but I think it has come up. So let's talk about humanitarian principles. Given the overall state of affairs with access, is it time to reckon with a new approach to guide principled action that goes beyond concepts of impartiality, neutrality, and independence? And to try to create a different way that matches better, perhaps, with humanitarian realities on the ground. And I would like just to hear your views on this, just briefly. Thank you.
I mean, I think the easy answer is, or the not so easy answer, but kind of the first answer is, in some ways, those humanitarian principles are more important than ever. I mean, I think we have to keep kind of telling the story and supporting our partners of why, in particular, kind of the impartial delivery of assistance, the neutrality of humanitarian actors is so critical for the project writ large. I think that's not to say that there aren't really difficult questions, particularly when you start to think about localization, when you start to think about basic service delivery in humanitarian context, when you start to look at the very real need to invest in fragile context in a much more sustained way, in an institution building way, even when the state is not super present, or when the state is super present and has some humanitarian capacity, like right now in Ukraine. I think we've been in a pretty robust dialogue in Kyiv and elsewhere about, there's a lot of cash, humanitarian cash that's flowing through humanitarian partners. You also have a Ministry of Social Protection that is supporting social safety net programs, and we as the US government are putting a lot of money into direct support for the Ukrainian government. Are there ways that some pieces of the humanitarian caseload can and should be supported by the government of Ukraine, a government that has the capacity in many ways and the willingness to meet a lot of the humanitarian needs of its population? They don't necessarily do the kind of vulnerability targeting that our humanitarian partners do. And at first, I think there was some resistance among our partners but we do it differently, you know? But can we work with them to take similar approaches? This requires, again, using new muscles, and making those kind of transitions doesn't negate the need to, for example, not take our eyes off of those that are living in non-government controlled areas behind the line of contact, who are their needs are not going to be met by the Ukrainian state. And so again, there will continue to be a robust need for humanitarian partners that can operate in an impartial way. But we do have to be comfortable with a certain amount of working with governments that are willing and able to meet the humanitarian needs of their populations.
I agree that actually, as we have more and more assertive governments, difficult parties were under attack, we should not yield on the humanitarian principles. They are more important than ever, in my view. The most misunderstood one is neutrality. Impartiality is intuitive. We go where the needs are, and that is usually not debated, not under attack, but neutrality is. And our Ukrainian partners are basically saying, I think I already mentioned that, we're not neutral. We want our government to win this. I understand it and I accept it. But we in NRC want to be there as soon as we have access to Crimea and parts of the Luhansk and Donetsk, where people speak Russian, where they may be indoctrinated by Russian TV, whatever. They will be very reluctant to work with those who come in with the force that will retake these areas. We would be able to work on both sides. That's neutrality. Some say, no, yeah, neutrality is really, we cannot criticize the president, and we need to still play tennis with the president's wife, and we be in bed with all parties in a way. That's neutrality. No, it's to be critical on behalf of the people in need of the various side, and at times criticize one side more than the other because they are doing most of the violations. So I think it's very important that it's part of our humanitarian negotiations effort, Sarah, funded by you, to explain that the humanitarian principle is a way we survive on the battlefield, really, and we need to live by them, but we also need to be smart and understand them, and the misunderstanding must be done away with.
Great. Well, Sarah, yes. Sarah, Jan, thank you so much, both of you, for your remarks, for your insightful responses. Really grateful to have you here today. Thank you. And thank you very much.
Our panel conversation now is going to look specifically at the impact of counterterrorism measures on humanitarian access. Before we begin, I want to once again thank the Norwegian Refugee Council for their partnership on this event and USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance for their support. I was also remiss in my earlier introduction for not acknowledging the hard work of my colleagues here at CSIS, the streaming broadcasting and events team that helped put this on and make it available for our colleagues all around the world. My colleague Jude Larnard, who has managed all the logistics of this event, and from NRC, Melody Knight, Dobby Brown, and Yasmin Eubanks, the team that's helped conceptualize this. Coming of age, I was in college during 9/11, and my entire professional life has been, in the humanitarian sector at least, has been framed in this context of a global war on terror, a battle against terrorism, a fight against extremism, whatever the narrative has been. We've been living in a world defined by a struggle against terror, or I have been, for my entire professional life. And only in the last few years have we started to see narrative shifts. The big issues are climate change. Now we talk about strategic competition, great power confrontation. And yet, as we take on all these new burdens and challenges that the humanitarian community has to navigate, the terrorism piece never went away. So it's still there, and it still remains a major challenge for humanitarian actors. Both the acts of terrorism themselves and the impact that has on civilian populations around the world, the kinetic actions taken by militaries, either Western or domestic, against terrorists or insurgents or armed groups in their own countries. But for the humanitarian community, and especially those that are based in Washington or Europe, the impact of the counterterrorism regulations that states have put into place to help reduce the amount of resources, financial and otherwise, going to groups designated as terrorism has remained an extremely onerous and difficult challenge to navigate, both the legal compliance issues, the fiscal issues it entails, but even just the pure operational access challenges that navigating these regulations entails. And so we're very grateful we have a real expert panel here today of colleagues to help us unpack some of the issues today, especially in the context of what we're seeing is incremental but meaningful changes. So joining us from New York, I'll start with the folks online. We have Professor Naz Modirzadeh, a professor of practice at the Harvard Law School, As long as I've worked on this issue, her writings and her emails and the testimonies that she's done have been really instrumental for my understanding of this issue set. We also have Aurélien Beauflet from UN OCHA. Aurélien is the Chief Policy Advice in the Planning Section at the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. And next to me on stage here, we have Rachel Alpert, a partner at Jenner & Block, who's also has a long experience working in the US government and continues to write on sanctions and the impact of sanctions on humanitarian action. And finally, Hichem Khadroui, the head of operations for Geneva Call. Hichem is the director of operations for Geneva Call, and I'll let him explain a little bit about what Geneva Call does and why this issue is salient for them. So we'll start here on stage with you, Hichem. Geneva Call's MO and purpose for being is to engage these non-state armed groups in a dialogue in order to improve their compliance with international humanitarian law, IHL. This includes issues around access denial. These groups are often designated by the United States, the European Union, the UN, and others as terrorist, and that creates logistical and operational challenges for these kinds of dialogues. Can you share with us a little bit the challenges that Geneva Call faces when choosing to open up a dialogue with these kinds of groups with respect to your own legal and operational safety?
Thank you very much. I hope that you can hear me well on the microphone. Hi to Naz and Aurélien. It's a pity that we don't meet. I come from Geneva, but I hope next time we can meet in New York. So thanks a lot, really much, Jacob, really for this question. Thank you as well for NRC and CSIS to organize this event. Maybe briefly, I will just explain in few words what we do. I think it's not maybe familiar with everyone. So our work mainly is to engage directly with armed groups in conflict zones to try to secure behavior change, concrete behavior change on the ground that benefit civilian populations. And this behavior change could be, for example, to release child soldiers, to vacate hospitals or civilian buildings, to not attack or loot trucks or, let's say, any other humanitarian assistance areas, and as well try to secure and preserve humanitarian space. So we try to negotiate with them directly so they understand the importance of as well preserving humanitarian space and not attacking humanitarian workers. So we have this direct engagement with them on a daily basis in 18 countries worldwide. We work with more than 150 armed groups from all over the world. And this direct engagement, of course, causes challenges, both, of course, on the security side, legally and operationally. And so we have the teams on the ground, of course, that are doing that. Myself as well, I'm been visiting a lot, Afghanistan, Ukraine, and Syria, Yemen, the Sahel, trying to talk and engage them directly. So we talk at the leadership level, but as well at the field commanders level. So, of course, city measures have an impact. This is clear. But I would like to distinguish between the local city measures, so the local designations by the governments, by the host governments, and what we have today, the designations by regional actors or global bodies, such as, you know, the US, the UN, African Union, and EU, and so on and so forth. So there is a difference because we have the possibility to engage with, you know, with the US, with the EU, at Brussels, at New York level, trying to explain and push for exceptions. And sometimes we have these good examples that were shared earlier by Jan. When it comes to discussing with local governments that are in direct war, in direct conflicts with these armed groups, it's a much different ballgame. Because here they face directly the effects of these armed groups, let's say attacks or whatever, and they are not really, let's say, versed into the intricacies of humanitarian principles. They don't care, to be frank with you. So talking with the Malian government, Syrian government, and the other government about giving us space, it's not that easy, and it causes direct challenges. For us, the first challenge, for example, is the fact that we don't have the right, legally speaking, to talk to armed groups. Example, in Nigeria, so the Nigerian government prohibits by law to discuss with illegal armed groups. And we have the same situation in various other countries. So you can be basically illegal and then subject to being arrested, being sentenced or expelled if you engage directly with these armed groups. Then you have the challenges when it comes to the financing. And here I talk about the donor community that are usually coming, the same donors are the same ones that have these sanctions, usually the Western world. And of course, if you ask for money, they will ask to do what with it? And if you say, but it's to speak with this armed group and this armed group, and they say, no, not with this armed group, and why not this armed group? And then you start to debate and negotiate and have to explain to them the importance of talking to everyone. And sometimes we are not financed or not funded because of our very work. And this causes issue on the ground because we help other organizations for them to get access to areas. We facilitate access for UN and for other organizations. If we don't get funded, we can't negotiate, and then organizations don't have access. And at the end, populations basically are not really being assisted. So there is a direct consequence as well, not only for us directly, but as well for the global, international, let's say, humanitarian community. So this is from the state, host state, and regional perspective. I would like as well to speak about the armed groups perspective. I think it's very important. We engage with them a lot. We ask them as well, how do they see these measures and these sanctions being imposed on them? How do you feel being labeled tomorrow morning as a terrorist? So we distinguish three main, let's say, reactions: don't care, do care, and don't know. Usually they don't know, and it's a bit unfortunate, but most of them have no clue actually that we have a lot of people in New York and elsewhere talking about Group A or Group B. So the don't care part of it, this is more the very extreme groups. They really don't care. They're not subject to any kind of international pressure. The ISIS types and others as well, not only ISIS. They don't care. You can label them the way they want, the way you want. For them, they will continue to act the way they want. So here's a very different way as well of interacting with them. The do care, this is pretty interesting because they are the ones that usually exert control over a portion of a territory. We call them de facto authorities. They control, they have, governance mechanisms, they have rules and regulations. They want to be seen basically as a solution to the state. I don't know, the Kurdish groups, for example, Somaliland, some groups in Myanmar and so on. So here, there's a lot of leeway, of course, because their behavior, basically, the way they behave, they see a direct consequence as well on the way they are labeled. So I think it's something that will be carrot and stick is pretty working well. The don't know types, the majority, they really don't know. And this is pretty interesting because they just need to know. And what we do directly, Geneva Call, is by training them, by bringing them, and I say really, in our hands, the reports where their names are being cited because they do exactions. Here they realize that, okay, if they change, there will be a different approach, and they are part of a, let's say, globalized, let's say, world. So I think every group has a different approach of doing it. And I would just want to finish and give the floor to my colleague here and to my colleagues here to say that we are based in Geneva because today Geneva is the only place in the world that is able to host and receive armed groups numerous times to speak about humanitarian work. So last year we've been inviting dozens of armed groups. The Taliban came, we had groups from Sahel, from Syria, so they come to us, we negotiate with them, they sign deeds of commitments with Geneva Call, and this is possible because in Geneva, there is no, let's say, applicability of the sanctions to the groups that come to speak about humanitarian issues. And I think this is very important because Geneva as a town, not even Switzerland as a country, but really Geneva as a town. And it's the only place that we know, and for me, it shows as well the importance of having this, let's say, safe havens worldwide where we could discuss with this type of groups, because this is the only way that we can, push forward agendas around humanitarian access, peace and stability. So yes, I just wanted to finish by this point.
Thanks for that, and the importance of that safe space, both physically in Geneva, but also in the nature of the work that you're doing. So Geneva Call is a relatively small and very hands-on and right in the thick of it organization. I want to turn now to Aurélien from the OCHA perspective and go up to kind of the systemic level. Can you talk to us a little bit about OCHA's role in identifying solutions to some of these major challenges, both for UN agencies and their partners? What are the key gains that you've seen made, and what are the challenges or the hurdles that you see in the future?
Yeah. Good morning, Jacob. Good morning, everyone. And thanks a lot for inviting OCHA to this CSIS and NRC event. So to answer your questions, I mean, before getting into the solution part, the first role of OCHA is to build consensus about the fact that there is an issue. And I'm starting with this because still today, some actors, especially on the counterterrorism side, but not only, are reluctant to acknowledge that there is an issue. And for that, OCHA's message has been pretty clear all along, and it's based on what we see in the field, in operations led by our partners, and what OCHA offices see across emergencies. And I can articulate it this way. I mean, first, the fact is that today counterterrorism legislations apply in most of the big humanitarian emergencies, whether it is Somalia, whether it is Palestine, whether it is Afghanistan, the Great Lakes region, whether it is counterterrorism legislation taken by host governments or counterterrorism legislation and measures taken by the UN, by donor states, and so on. So counterterrorism is everywhere in humanitarian operation. The second aspect to that is that for humanitarian organizations and the way humanitarian operation works, it is almost impossible for humanitarian organizations not to have contact with what are called terrorist groups and not to transfer resources to this group. Basic things, humanitarian organizations need to pay utility bills to companies which are owned by listed individuals or controlled by listed armed groups. They need to implement programs with health ministries, which might be controlled by listed entities. They need to provide medical care to wounded fighters belonging to groups which might be terrorists. So really, there's this clash between counterterrorism and humanitarian action in most emergencies where we work. And this has very practical consequences and creates very practical risks. I mean, we see humanitarian organization and staff being prosecuted or detained and harassed on the argument that they're supporting terrorism just because they're doing their job. We see humanitarian organizations who suspend programs or are reluctant to engage in certain humanitarian programs because they fear of falling the fool of counterterrorism legislations. That's a chilling effect that has been described in many articles. We see private actors such as banks, which support humanitarian operation that practice de-risking, that refuse to process some of the transactions humanitarian organizations need to implement programs. So, for instance, we see considerable delays in transfer of funds between banks, sometimes several months because of counterterrorism legislation. And we see also some donors adopting policies which are problematic in terms of of principal humanitarian action. So, for instance, some donors ask humanitarian organizations to vet beneficiaries against the counterterrorism list. So in an instance, an organization running an education program was asked to vet children against a list of terrorists. We see donors who pressure humanitarian organizations to gather intelligence for counterterrorism purposes. So, for instance, explaining who they meet, when they meet, who was in the room. I mean, these are really practical consequences. And then we see also some actors trying to use humanitarian organizations for other objectives than humanitarian action. So, for instance, we see actors trying to argue that humanitarian actions needs to support the prevention of violent extremism. So I give this very concrete example, and we can go back to that, but just because I think that's the role of OCHA also, to build this consensus, to articulate what the problem is. And then that brings me to your question, Jacob, about what are the solutions and what are some of the progress we saw in the past year. So the role of OCHA is really to try to bring together the counterterrorism community and the humanitarian community to have this dialogue and try to find solutions together. And we've had some incremental progress over the past years, including at the Security Council, which adopted several resolutions acknowledging that counterterrorism legislation can have a negative impact on humanitarian operation, and inviting member states to take into effect this impact in their legislation. We had more recently Resolution 2664, which basically creates a standing exemption at the Council for all UN sanctions regimes. So it's not only counterterrorism is sanctions, but it's related. You have the 1267 sanctions regime, which is a counterterrorism sanctions regime under that. So there is progress. But what we note is that many of these measures are either vague, like some of the resolution calling on member states to take into effect, or they're limited in scope. That's 2664, the resolution. It applies only to asset freezes, while counterterrorism legislations are much wider than asset freezes. They include financial regulation, criminal law, donors policies, and so on. So at the moment, what we're trying to do with OCHA and our partners and member states and the private sector is really look at 3-4 areas where we think progress needs to be made. The first area is really to make sure that the legal frameworks is framed the right way in terms of conducive humanitarian action. So making sure that standing carve-outs are included in all counterterrorism legislation. And that's the first thing we're asking for and working for with our partners. The second thing is making sure that this legal framework at international or national level is being socialized with humanitarian organizations and with private sector organizations to really explain to these actors what legislation say, what is permitted, what is not permitted, and really have this constructive engagement and finding practical solutions. And the last two areas we work on is risk management. We're really trying to move with our donors in particular from a conversation on risk avoidance to a discussion on risk mitigation. We need to acknowledge that in areas where we work, there are risks in terms of counterterrorism. At the same time, ignoring this risk, not doing anything will not make us progress. So we need to manage these risks the proper way. And one way to do that is first to acknowledge that today, most humanitarian organizations have due diligence policies and risk mitigation measures in place that work pretty well. Today, to my knowledge, there's no credible report that suggests that there is systematic aid diversion to the benefit of terrorist groups. And the last area we work on is really with member states here in New York to try to depoliticize humanitarian action in the context of counterterrorism. So, for instance, we have the negotiation on the global counterterrorism strategy starting at the UN very soon. And here, the objective for us will be to make sure that member states acknowledge that there is an issue in terms of impact of counterterrorism on principal humanitarian action, and that the counterterrorism strategy needs to be used to mitigate the risk we see. With that, over to you, Jacob.
Thank you so much. There's a lot that I already want to come back to in terms of, you talk about consensus. Jan talked about consensus this morning, but having worked in Washington NGO coordination meetings, the idea of humanitarian consensus seems as a pipe dream of some sort. But let me turn to you, Naz. You've obviously been following these issues for many years. How do you see, in particular, the UN system evolving to dial back some of the most challenging elements of CT sanction regimes and other points of progress or challenges that remain?
Yeah, thank you so much, Jacob. And it's really good to be here with my old friends, Aurélien and Hichem and others. And thank you so much to the organizers, particularly for allowing us to participate virtually. So, Jacob, as you said, this has been a journey of, I think, over a decade for many of us working on these issues. And so I'll try to answer your question just very briefly with a few reflections. One, on kind of your question about the UN system as a whole. Two, perhaps an unusual bright spot that Aurélien alluded to, this new resolution 2664. And then three, some areas where at least I see big remaining questions and opportunities on the horizon in terms of the intersection between humanitarian action and CT. So first, in terms of the UN system as a whole, Jacob, I think your observation at the outset was really important that in the West, at least, and particularly in the US, we seem to be seeing a turn away from CT, almost a sense that CT as a foreign policy issue, as the global scourge against humanity, is in the rearview mirror, having been superseded by other national security threats and concerns. And I think this can almost create the impression that at the global level, that somehow is also the case. And I think, as you said, it's important to remember global CT at the UN level and at the regional level remains healthily funded. It remains a significant architecture that is seeking to expand its reach and its turf into virtually every corner of the United Nations. And in some ways, there is a question in my mind that as the states that built this architecture turn their interests away from CT, what is the strategic direction of UN counterterrorism? Who is providing that strategic direction? And is this going to be a kind of a massive lumbering architecture with an enormous amount of reach and funding, but without really a shared consensus around its purpose and values? Two, for those of us who work in this area, I think for many years, my job was just to come to panels and say horrible, gloomy things about counterterrorism and humanitarian action. So it is indeed a distinct pleasure to say something positive. And that something positive is, as Aurélien suggested, in December 2022, the Security Council decided Resolution 2664, creating a standing humanitarian carve-out across 14 sanctions regimes, including the 1267 regime, which is arguably certainly the highest number of individual and entity designations, and also the key area of overlap between sanctions and counterterrorism at the Security Council. My purposes here, it's less important to get into the technicalities of the impact of the carve-out on sanctions. We can talk about that in the Q&A, but rather the kind of ethos and the language we heard around the decision. So first, key states that had for years denied that the Security Council was having any adverse impact on humanitarian action through its resolutions were in the lead. Key member states and Security Council member states, such as the US, indicated that they were proud to introduce a landmark resolution that will save lives. This was the kind of the mood at the council at the deciding of 2664. And indeed, the resolution set out its intention to clarify and preserve humanitarian activity. So what's noteworthy here is there was some language missing that we're very used to when it comes to these discussions. One, there was no reference to balancing between the values of humanitarian action and security, sanctions, counterterrorism. Second, the resolution arguably does away with the kind of zero tolerance approach that Aurélien mentioned earlier, at least as to the asset freezes and at least as to the carve out with sanctions. The council appears to be embracing a pretty significant shift in its security policy that says, when it comes to humanitarian action, we understand that there are going to be transfers of resources to designated individuals and entities, and we accept that risk when it comes to the narrow scope of 2664. So now what matters is interpretation and implementation, sort of how we see this resolution affecting both council implementation of the language, but also, perhaps more importantly, each member state's implementation of the carve-out into their domestic law and policy. Let me close with what may be on the horizon here. So one is a significant question many of us are grappling with. What are the implications of this ethos, of this possible policy shift for the counterterrorism resolutions of the Security Council? Will the underlying values of 2664, the idea that it's saving lives, the idea that it's clarifying the mess that the Security Council has arguably created for many humanitarian organizations in terms of their operations, will that result in a significant shift in CT policy and approaches to the interpretation of CT? Second, for monitoring and assessment bodies like the Financial Action Task Force, Counterterrorism Executive Directorate, how will they interpret 2664 carve-out in the realm of CT? And finally, perhaps most challenging, what about domestic criminal laws that are implementing Security Council resolutions obliging all member states to create criminal legislation preventing and criminalizing the provision of resources to terrorists in light of this carve-out and what I would argue is its underlying spirit. So I think a lot of opportunity this year and in the years to come, but really requiring a continued dedicated focus by the kinds of groups that are in this room and that have been working on this issue for so long. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I'm interested in this discrepancy you kind of laid out of a massive shift in ethos and thinking through this resolution, but also the UN CT architecture being in some ways a rudderless ship. And I'd like to sort of maybe come back to that. But first I want to turn to you, Rachel, and bring it back to the Washington perspective, especially in the context of what we heard about 2664. And Jan mentioned this morning in the opening, the United States went from being, he used worst to best, we'll say, among the most challenging partners on these issues to among the most constructive. So we've seen this tremendous progress with respect to sanctions, but we also know that, at least on the US domestic side, we have the material support for terror provision, which remains in force. And some of these underlying legal challenges remain, even while there are efforts to ease the burden on the NGOs. So can you speak a little bit to the state of play here in Washington, in particular where this Congress and this administration are with respect to both the sanctions, but also the material support for terror provision?
Yes, thank you. And thank you very much for having me today with this great panel. This has been a very interesting space to watch over the past decade. I remember starting working on issues related to humanitarian assistance and access about 13, 14 years ago when we were looking for reassurances that assistance could be provided in al-Shabaab controlled areas of Somalia. And the best we could get at that point was a policy statement that it was not the policy of the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control, that it was not a priority for enforcement to go after humanitarian actors. So that had to be enough at the time because that's all we had. It was interesting because that was also a time when there was a UN Security Council resolution designating al-Shabaab, where there was a UN carve-out for humanitarian actors. It was one of the first ones, if not the first. And so now we've seen kind of an evolution since that time. There were but later on the designation of Ansar Allah in Yemen, the Houthis. That was quickly undone in, I guess it was January 2021, get my dates right. And that was in large part because of a recognition of the chilling effect that a foreign terrorist organization designation has on the ability to provide humanitarian assistance in areas of greatest need. And so these were kind of concrete domestic actions that set the tone that we have seen in this administration thus far on humanitarian assistance. And that kind of through the response and listening to the issues on the ground in Afghanistan when the Taliban took over and the delivery of humanitarian assistance became very complicated. The OFAC general licenses that were issued then and the work that the US government did through the UN Security Council to create authorizations specific to Afghanistan, and then last year the UNSCR 2664. In US domestic law, the way we've seen that UN Security Council resolution implemented is through broad general licenses across US sanctions programs, authorizing humanitarian assistance and other categories of assistance. It's really a broader list of general license authorizations than we've previously seen, including disarmament, DDR efforts, and peace-building efforts, which was a novel addition there. We've also seen other steps to provide reassurance to humanitarian actors, but there's still a lot of room and a lot of confusion in this space and a lot of effort to change. And there's pushback, especially in Congress, especially with a House that's skeptical at times of the benefit and utility of humanitarian assistance as against the counter-terrorist priorities and policies, and a lack of understanding about what it is necessary to provide assistance on the ground. And so these are the areas now where I see the greatest need and the greatest work going forward. And I think part of this is identifying, okay, so we have the US implementation of UNSCR 2664 through these UN general, through these OFAC general licenses. That's the way the US has done it. Other countries are doing it differently, so we're already getting to a patchwork of local laws. But looking at the US example, just as one specific example of all the complexities here, the way that the authorizations have been implemented are through the sanctions program. So that's under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the IEEPA statute, which is the basis for most US sanctions. But as Naz mentioned, it's not the only legal authority in play here. So there's the material support statute, which is the criminal prohibition on the provision of material support or resources to foreign terrorist organizations, which does not have these sorts of exemptions. And that is a glaring hole in the nature of the authorizations that the US can provide, even where the US government has been providing policy reassurances on that front. There are also export controls, which are implemented under a variety of domestic US laws. Most notably recently are export controls that prohibit exports to Syria. And we saw the real impact that these export controls have had on the ability to quickly and effectively provide a humanitarian response to the earthquake, because it creates an additional lag time that requires review and authorization by the Commerce Department's Bureau of Industry and Security before items can be exported or re-exported into Syria to provide this humanitarian response. And so this is just an example of kind of the broad array of laws that we need to deal with so that organizations can effectively operate on the ground. And so I think as a next step, I would love for the laws and the policies and the very clear guidance to evolve such that I don't have a job anymore, so that it's very clear to organizations that as a policy matter, the donors like the US government, like the EU and the UK and UN have decided it is in our policy, it is to the benefit to the world, our greater foreign policy, to provide humanitarian assistance in these situations. So then taking a perspective from the ground, speaking to the actors who need to implement that assistance and really take stock, identify all the remaining roadblocks that are there, because there are many, and then meticulously and effectively chip away at them so that resources can go to those in need while preventing and mitigating the risk of diversion to terrorists, but in a way that's not going to serve as a roadblock to humanitarian assistance going forward.
Thanks. There's so many follow-up questions, so we'll just have to pick a couple. I'm going to come back to you, Hisham, and ask you two questions to respond to some of the comments from our colleagues. The first is, in your engagement with your donors, have you seen evidence of the mental shift that Naz spoke about, a move away from zero tolerance and a move away from this balancing narrative? Or is that still yet to filter from that level at the UN Security Council to your day-to-day negotiation about your partnerships? And then what you mentioned about the domestic governments. I mean, this panel, I think, is very much thinking about donors and the regulations at that level, but this is a huge problem. States that have either modeled their domestic legal frameworks on those that you know, the United States or the Europeans, or those that were kind of pushed out by the UN special agencies, it's very easy to create a lot of restriction, and it's really hard to unwind them. So have you had dialogue with some of those governments, not about your ability to negotiate with the armed groups, but about their own legal frameworks and the challenges they present?
Thank you very much. Yeah, on the first question, I think it's linked to what my colleagues were saying. I mean, you have these positive steps that were taken with this resolution, but the implementation is, of course, taking time. And the diffusion of it, just even the awareness of it. I mean, when I go a lot, I was in Brussels a couple of weeks ago, and even for them, you know, it's still foreign. So there is still delays, there are still a lack of full understanding of what they can do now, what they can do and how they can basically allow, let's say, organizations, you know, to engage with these groups, and funding can be done, can be provided without any risk. So we still have these delays. How we mitigate them? By ourselves, I mean, NRC, of course, and other colleagues, continuing to educate. And it's not because we have a resolution that was, you know, adopted in New York that automatically in Brussels and elsewhere, and at the local powers, you know, in Stockholm, in Bern, that automatically there is an understanding. So there is still a huge need of advocacy, I would say bilateral advocacy, but as well in panels or in forums, because we still see some reluctance. And as well, from the private world, and I think Aurélien, alluded to that, I mean, the banking systems. Banks are so afraid. I mean, I can tell you, and Swiss banks, they are not known for their openness and transparency. I can tell you how difficult it is to make them accept that we use them to channel money. I mean, it's our biggest nightmare. And I say Geneva Call, but I think I can speak on behalf of other organizations. Afghanistan is almost impossible. I mean, we have to bring cash. Myself, I had to go to Libya with cash, a lot of cash, just to go and pay our staff and try to provide, you know, our humanitarian assistance, because banks are saying no. We are not going to take this risk. And I can tell you they don't really care about resolution 2664 or whatever. They have their own, let's say, risk assessment. So we need to embark with us as well the private systems, the private, let's say, world, and especially the banks. This is for us a big challenge. On the local states, it's very interesting because I can give two examples. One in the Sahel region, one with Mali and one with Burkina Faso. With Mali, since, of course, the coup d'etat and, let's say, the stronger, let's say, positioning of the current government, which is a military government. I was in Mali, I think, last month. Everyone from the cabinet directors to the deputy ministers, they're all colonels. So they come from the military. So I can tell you they don't know a thing about what we'll be discussing right now. So it's extremely difficult. They would not even understand. However, Burkina Faso, still we have a coup d'etat, still we have, you know, military in place, but we've been engaging with them since early on, and there were some positive discussions and understanding about the fact that they should allow, you know, let's say, organizations to speak with the armed groups. And why here? Because there's an understanding that this is one of the only ways to reach sustainable peace. I think it's really different how the host government is positioning itself. If it's coming from the only solution is to crush armed groups because they are all enemies, then it's very hard to discuss with. If we have a government that understands that it's not a solution because it does not work, and they saw examples like the US in Afghanistan. I mean, you have a mighty power with an alliance of I don't know how many countries that had to run from guys in flip-flops and Kalashnikov in their hands. So they see that maybe it's not the solution. So one solution could be discussing, talking. And if they can't, maybe other can, like Geneva Call or other organizations. So it's really at what stage the government is in their thinking. I think when they failed only military options, this is where basically they are more comfortable into, let's say, allowing, let's say, armed organizations talking to armed groups. And I want as well to finish by, we have the responsibility, the organizations, to show impact and quick impact. We just cannot say, give us access, but for what? And then years after years, we don't show things. I think this is very important because there is a strong perception from armed groups, from the states, that we are not in the country for the things that we've been saying we've been doing. There is a lot of, I can tell you, allegations, and these have been told directly by host governments, by armed groups leaders, that you guys are here for spying on us, you are working with the West against us. This exists. I mean, I can tell you it's not just paranoia, it exists, I've been told. So we have as well to come and show concrete and clear impact for populations to basically counter this narrative. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
And thank you for raising the question of impact. You're talking about the impact of your operations, but I want to turn to you, Naz, and talk about the impact of the sanctions. I mean, especially in Washington, you get the question like, well, what haven't you done? How has it been, like, what has been impacted negatively? And oftentimes you end up trying to prove a counterfactual. You're trying to make a quantitative assessment of stuff that didn't happen. And so I'm curious, from your perspective, what is the importance of having good data on the impact? And having observed the process in New York, I mean, how much of it was a data-driven argument and how much of it was, a narrative or kind of a higher-level argument where the data was an important piece of it, but it wasn't driven by that kind of hard number crunching?
Yeah, thanks, Jacob. It's a hugely important and difficult question. So my impression is that in New York, it depends, I think, how we define data. So I think if you include qualitative testimonies from the field, evidence from interviews, structured interviews, then certainly the amount of research and advocacy and information gathering that's been carried out by groups like NRC, Interaction, OCHA, and others was crucial. I think if we mean data in terms of real quantitative data of impact, and this idea throughout the years that many member states in the context of CT have said, well, we want to know exactly how many people are losing their lives because of CT regulation, or we want to know exactly how many convoys are not getting through because of CT regulation. I advise humanitarian organizations to push back on this request. I think on a few grounds. One is that causal link, the idea that a counterterrorism resolution at the Security Council could be directly linked in some satisfactory statistical manner to humanitarian outcomes is not an ask that you can deliver on for a variety of reasons. It doesn't mean there is no impact. It just means that that's not a challenge a humanitarian organization should accept, in my view. But second, and much more importantly, it is asking humanitarian organizations in many jurisdictions and in many contexts, not least of which the US, to document their violation of criminal laws. So you cannot undertake a quantitative assessment of impact in a meaningful manner, certainly not in an academically or statistically meaningful manner, in a context in which part of the impact is that the organizations need to be able to document activities which could be seen as criminal under overbroad legislation in a variety of jurisdictions. So I think data matters, evidence certainly matters. You want to have evidence-informed policymaking, but I think it's crucial for humanitarian actors to be clear about the limits, both on what can be identified through research, and second, to be clear about the unacceptable risks that would be posed to humanitarian actors seeking to, quote, prove that impact, and put it back on the donors, put it back on the member states. You know, if you are the ones providing funding for humanitarian action, then it is your responsibility to ensure that that is being done in an efficient and effective manner. But I think it is difficult and in some cases bordering on impossible to provide quantitative data of impact in a manner that can be seen as directly causal.
Thanks. I'm reminded of the from The Wire, you know, Stringer Bell. You don't take notes on a criminal conspiracy, right? Asking people to document their own violations seems like a bit unfair. So maybe like let's just stay with OCHA then and come back to you, Aurélien. You know, as a coordinating mechanism, how do you at OCHA track the impact of these CT measures? You know, what OCHA has access challenges, you know, tracking methodologies. So how do you think about tracking this impact given that role of coordination and that's somewhat removed from the NGO day-to-day experience?
Thanks. I mean, it's complicated because as Rachel and Naz suggested, in any context, you have a web of legislation, resolution, counterterrorism, legislations, sanctions regime that apply. And very often, what member states want to know is what is the concrete impact of one particular measure. This is almost impossible to entangle, and we see it right now in the context of Syria, the Syria earthquake response. So that's why, a bit building on what Naz said, we've been very careful not to fall too much in that trap, to put it this way, of like constantly arguing on what is, and stay at the level of saying, look, this web creates very concrete, this web of measures creates very concrete hurdles, and we need to address it together and build this advocacy on with very powerful examples and telling examples. So, and that has worked to some extent, and it has really contributed to changing the discussion between humanitarians, member states, and counterterrorism actors. Having said that, having worked a lot on the Afghanistan exemption, but also on 2664 resolution, what made the real difference and what really triggered the policy shift Rachel described is a political dynamic. Let's not be naive about that. It's sanctions in particular have become a very contentious issue between member states at the UN. And there was a willingness from some states to show that their sanctions were not the reasons for humanitarian issues in particular crises. So that's really what in Afghanistan, but also in other places. So that's really one of the key elements. In other words, you can have the best data possible, and we should give data, but it's not enough. You need to have some political will, and in this case, the starter line. Just maybe one or two side comments to say that we will have to see in the coming months if what applies to sanctions will be translated in the counterterrorism agenda of the UN. And I'm saying that because there's not many areas of consensus right now at the UN between member states, as you can imagine. But one area of consensus is actually that they need to fight terrorism, and that member states at national level needs to have the latitude to do it the way they see best fit. So we really need to see whether this will be confirmed. And one last remark said that one flip side I want to flag of this incremental progress is that measures taken by the Security Council and member states also come with obligation for humanitarian organizations. The obligation to show impact of humanitarian programs, but also of exemptions, but also obligations to report more and more on different aspects of around aid diversion, due diligence policies to member states. And we need to make, and that's perfectly normal and perfectly okay, but we need to make sure that that doesn't become a way to control humanitarian actions by political actors. Over to you.
Thanks. Rachel, coming back to you, I have two questions. They may be connected, but I'll ask them both and do as you see fit. And then maybe we can open up for a question or two from our esteemed audience here. The first is, going back to this 2664 and the efforts there. I mean, you've written on this issue, you've advised the humanitarians. Were there elements, and you come from working in government, so you've been on the other side of this. Are there pieces of the advocacy and policy discussion that led to this humanitarian exemption that can be applied to the stickier challenge of the material support for terror provision in the United States? And we have seen now some sort of bipartisan consensus on the AUMFs, the authorizations for the use of military force. There's real discussion about what the United States is doing in Somalia and Syria. And I'm wondering if those discussions also create some space for a broader conversation about the negative impacts of this war footing, this counterterrorism framework as a way to see the world.
Good questions. And I'll take the last first from a very broad lens without specifically delving into the AUMF. I mean, I think, what this is really showing us is, this is a great time for taking stock, right? We've been in the midst of this war on terror since we were both in college. We are 2 decades, 20 years later now. And so the question is, so there were a number of tools that came into being in that era, and the AUMF among them. And so, without saying any specific outcome is the right outcome, it's time to take a step back, to look at all of the tools in our counterterrorism arsenal in the context of the very necessary humanitarian needs around the world, and not just humanitarian, but broader needs for development assistance. There's not agreement necessarily on what constitutes humanitarian assistance. And I'm not saying we need to define it, but I'm saying we need flexibility to, on the one hand, prioritize development and assistance while accounting for the counterterrorism posture we're in. So, that's kind of the guiding light, the principle that I think should be informing these policy decisions, which should be happening. And then in terms of the concrete steps to create the necessary carve-outs to, for example, the material support statute, what I've observed in the time I've been working on these issues is a very concerted effort by those in the international community, the international NGO community, who are on the ground in these environments that are quite challenging to work in, engaging with each other and with those who are making the policies, making the decisions, to identify first among themselves, okay, what are the issues, what are the roadblocks we're facing, how can we come up with authorizations that would avoid those roadblocks, and then presenting those solutions to the policymakers so that they can then implement them. That's identifying the categories of assistance to authorize, the mechanisms through which to authorize it, whether it be OFAC general licenses or, in the material support statute context, a statutory change, or perhaps in the interim, some greater clarity from the executive branch on how specific terms will be applied and defined, at least to provide reassurance to those on the ground what is and is not allowed, drawing more bright line rules, because when we do not have clear guidance, there is a chilling effect on implementation of assistance.
Thanks. So we have, the system works, so if you want to send in questions, I have a little iPad here. We have a first question from a Joel Charney. Let's get into brass tacks here, right? It's the Patriot Act. And do you think that there's any possibility, political or practical, to get an amendment or an otherwise legislative solution to the material support for terror?
I won't say never. You know, seeing the evolution from the with the general licenses that we've seen, you know, from the time in 2010 when this issue first became discussed to now, nobody thought we were going to see these broad general licenses across programs. Granted, that's an executive action, not a congressional action. But I wouldn't say never. And I think the key is really honing in on what is the issue we are trying to solve, defining it specifically and concretely, and identifying a specific solution to it. So it's not saying that we want to allow diversion to terrorists. That's nobody's goal. We want to prevent assistance from being diverted to terrorists, but we want to do it in a way that allows the organizations that have been tasked and mandated to provide that assistance to carry out their jobs using the congressionally appropriated funds oftentimes to do it. And so again, I think specific definitions might help get over some roadblocks in Congress, but who knows? It's a long game.
Yeah, you think about the example that Hisham raised of carrying bags of cash. I mean, from an accounting and a tracking of donor funds, you know, it's the bitter irony is these regulations have created methodologies to get around them that fundamentally undermine the intent of the regulations. And it makes it a very complex issue to handle. Any more questions from the audience before we turn back to our panelists for some final thoughts? Feel free, don't be shy. Okay, great. While we wait, you can also send them in. I have the iPad here. Let me maybe come back to you, Naz. I mean, perhaps the same question I put to Rachel here in your crystal ball. You know, and it's the way that you describe this shift in terms of the loss of the language of balancing the interests and that shift away from zero tolerance. I mean, I can remember writing my own NGO reports where you it was almost like Control A. You put that sentence in at the beginning, and then you moved on to what you wanted to say. You know, what can we expect to see in the future? Are there things down the pipeline that we should be looking at to focus our efforts? We had a conversation this morning about advocacy around access. You know, where are, in a limited community, right? The humanitarian community of advocacy is quite small. So where should efforts be focused? Where are the best opportunities that have the maximum impact?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, you know, just building on what Rachel said, but connecting that with something Aurelian said at the beginning, of course, the really tricky thing about this advocacy is it's true that no humanitarian organization would say our goal is to provide support to terrorists. It is also true that 2664 does envision the possibility of transfers of resources in narrow and particular contexts. And second, of course, in some areas like medical care, it is part of humanitarian activity to provide medical care to all wounded and sick in armed conflict, including those who might be designated as terrorists. So the advocacy is extra hard here because it's often not as simple as just saying, of course, nobody wants to provide any sort of assistance to anyone who might be designated as terrorists. Second, your question is a very particular one. In a limited number of advocates and people who have the resources to be focused on advocacy, and in a world of many ways in which this problem manifests, I, at this moment, would not advise focusing on the material support statute in the United States. Of course, Rachel is right that we can't predict, but my crystal ball does not see drastic change from Congress to the material support statute anytime soon. I would focus more on advocacy related to further implementation by the executive branch of 2664, expanding into CT, and perhaps equally importantly, ensuring that CT implementation in a number of other jurisdictions, so host countries, but also other donors, reflects the perhaps new ethos. And finally, as Hisham said, private sector, private sector, private sector. How do you take these changes and ensure that governments are actually communicating to banks and other entities that there is an expanded range of conduct that can be engaged in by the private sector which would not expose them to liability. I think that is where I would focus limited resources and be realistic about what looks like it could at least shift or start to change, as opposed to those areas where, of course, we would like to see changes, but where we may not see the political possibility in the US right now.
Thanks. We do have a question up front here, so if one of our friends with the mic can reach you. If not, you can just ask the question and I'll repeat it for our online audience. And if you could introduce yourself as well, please.
Hello. Okay, this works. Hi, my name is Laetitia Diatezwa. I'm a contractor for the Department of State. I particularly had a question to follow up on your questions about maximum efforts. In the previous discussions we've heard throughout the morning, there have been both an emphasis on a need for advocacy, but also on a need to understand the limitations of the extraneous efforts being put on local actors, particularly what they're able to do and what they're not able to do. So my question for, the group at large is how to move forward on the need for advocacy as well as engagement in diplomacy while balancing the extended risk that may put on local actors and implementers who may both have to lead this efforts of advocacy whilst also doing some work in these hard to reach areas where they are dealing with actors who perhaps view them both as enemies and as well trying to balance their roles, perhaps being representatives of larger groups that may not necessarily have the best reputation with those actors on the ground. Thank you.
Thanks for your question. Maybe we can start on the screen with you, Aurélien. Some thoughts about both the limitations of advocacy and the potential impact this kind of advocacy and work on this issue might have on the local actors who have become, central to the discussion about shifting the balance of humanitarian work.
Look, on advocacy and humanitarian diplomacy, I think it's fair to say that it's been fairly successful over the past years. I mean, I've been following this issue for quite a while, and we're definitely in a better place today than where we were 10 years ago. I think one thing we should do as humanitarians is also recognize the constraints member states and government and political actors are under. I mean, if I take the example of the US, there's an extremely difficult history with terrorism. I'm French, it's the same. And for any government to come back on some of the legislation that have been enacted or to amend them, it's complicated with the public opinion. And we need to recognize that, and we need to work with them to manage some of the risks they're creating by giving space to humanitarians, to be honest. So I think that needs to be part of our advocacy. Second, on local actors and risks, I mean, I've come back to what I said at the beginning. We need to be very specific about what we need in terms of space and be very specific about how we're managing risks and which due diligence policies we're putting in place. And here, it's not like adopting carve-outs is opening the floodgates. Preventing aid diversion, ensuring that humanitarian assistance goes to the most vulnerable, it's not only an issue of terrorism from a humanitarian perspective, it's our mandate, it's our mission. So we need to do that. And when we work with the local actors, I mean, it's true, some of the capacity might be less than international organization, but it's not like we're providing assistance without any control or without looking at what's going on. And today, there's not been a lot of systemic aid diversion. For us, in terms of advocacy, it's important we explain what is in place and how we mitigate some of the risk, and how also we work with some local actors to help them reinforce their own system and how we control our partners, including local organizations, to avoid aid diversion. And I would end by saying that we need to realize that we invest together between humanitarian actors and counterterrorism actors, and that we need to have this dialogue like today. We need to have this engagement, and we need to include private sector partners in that. That's the only way we'll be able to make sure that member states can continue to fight terrorism the way they want. That's not really my job. but also do it in a way that respects international humanitarian law and respect humanitarian space and the capacity of organization to operate on the ground. Over to you.
Thanks. Naz, any thoughts on that final question or any final thoughts you wish to share?
Just definitely supporting everything Aurélien just said, and also to add that I think it's, Jacob, I think you said at the beginning that a consensus is hard to build in all kinds of places, but also within the humanitarian community. And I think here there can definitely be effective labor sharing between local organizations and international NGOs, and then of course UN humanitarian agencies in terms of who takes the bulk of the work of dealing with this issue, and in some ways how you might even provide sort of cover for local implementing partners and also local organizations. But I think the question is, it can't be dealt with purely by this answer, right? The question really speaks to some of the underlying political challenges that local organizations face that are not easily addressed by due diligence or by compliance practices or by any of these issues, but rather really go back to the question of local CT and other measures that create very, very real risks for local organizations. Thanks.
Thanks. And turning to the stage, Hichem, do you have any final thoughts or want to respond to that question as well?
Thank you very much. No, yeah, just on the risk on local actors, these risks are increasing because we see a transfer from the global discussion to the local, let's say, governments that are now, being more assertive and putting more restrictions. So definitely the people that are greater at risk are the ones on the ground. And here, one way as well is to better equip them with the knowledge and the fact that what they do is legal. And I think it's important, and Jan spoke about that earlier enough, the capacity building that is done, but it's mostly for international organizations. I mean, with CCHN and others, I've been myself on panels trying to explain to UN principles. It's great, but who is taking care about, the local organizations? Who is capacitating them as well, giving them the knowledge, giving them the reassurance? And you are reassured when you know that what you do is legal. And I think it's very important. So, and when we speak about local, for those of you here that have been working in the field, we don't speak about the local NGOs that are located in the capitals. Mostly, unfortunately, they are very close to the regime. But the ones that are really out there, the community-based organizations, the grassroots actors, the traditional leaders, forms of organizations in the field is not what we see. They're not, perfectly, formalized and organized, but they are the ones acting on the ground. Women association, youth. So how we can better make sure to accompany them as well into their actions, giving them the security by providing them with the information and being there as well when they may face, some legal or administrative issues. So this is on the point on advocacy, and I would just want maybe to finish on 3 points. I think labeling matters. Labeling armed groups by being terrorists. If you are a state, at the end of the day, that's fine. When organizations are using this label, this for me is an issue. Because we know that we don't want to politicize aid, but by labeling them this way, you are politicizing already the aid because you are putting them in the political box. Terrorism, there's no legal definition, it's a political definition. So I think we have to refrain, and I speak we, the humanitarian organizations as a whole, to use political labeling when we communicate, when we have bilateral discussion with states, because this, of course, is not neutral. I mean, it comes with a price. This is the first point. And my last point, if we look forward, we've been dealing with city measures and consequences because we've been facing radical Islamist groups. I mean, let's be honest, in the past 15 years, these measures came really harsh because we've been working in the Middle East, in Afghanistan, and so on and so forth. But the new conflicts may not be in this region, will be potentially in Asia, around the Chinese Sea and other countries. So we have as well to maybe anticipate what will be the sanctions that will be posed when we have to come and deliver needed aid. And my fear, it will come, I think, from the states. I mean, the assertiveness of states will be increasing, the states that are at the regional level. Regional actors will be as well much more involved. BRICS as well will have a bigger role to play. So we have as well to compose with that. I don't have a particular answer to it, but just maybe a food for thought to anticipate what will come in the next decade. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And Rachel, some final thoughts in response to the comments or the question, or anything you wish to share with our audience before we close?
Great. And I think, Hisham, what you're describing is really kind of, as Jacob started things off, the geopolitical shift that we've seen where, the focus is not just terrorism, but there are many other geopolitical issues that are here and are on the horizon that will impact risk profiles for everyone. But going back to the question and to kind of the point of the local actors on the ground, the importance of empowering and educating those who are on the front lines of assistance is critical. It also goes the other way, because these are the actors who are on the ground, who are closest to the delivery of assistance, and it's so important for their experiences and the actual implementation challenges that they face to make it back along the line of those who are the prime grantees, back to the grantors, the donors, so that there can be truly informed policymaking in this space. So even though we're not going to get specific and clear numbers or anything like that, and as Naz wisely recommended, we should not be collecting them, or at least the organizations operating on the ground should not be, identifying the very real challenges that are faced then allows the policymakers to figure out how to effectively overcome them. Whether it's material support statute, if that's not happening anytime soon, there are other tools of foreign policy, defining regulations, coming out with policy guidance, coming out with additional licenses and authorizations, tackling export controls, which are a real barrier. So the first step is identifying the challenges on the ground, and that's where communication is key, both from the local actors to the folks that they are working with interim in the chain, among laterally organizations that are providing assistance, and also with the government donors.
Thank you so much. So a ton of content. One issue that we didn't really get into that you mentioned, but we didn't have a chance to interrogate, we'll have a session tomorrow about sanctions and financial access, and I'm going to put in a plug for some of CSIS's own work. We put out a report a few months back specifically on financial access and the importance of dialogue between all the component parts of the humanitarian system, the UN, the NGOs, the banks, the commercial providers, and of course the governments, donors, and otherwise. So I'd encourage everyone to come back and watch that panel tomorrow. For today, let me ask Legal and to join us, and we'll come back for our afternoon sessions at 1 p.m. Thank you so much.
Thank you.